Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Cameron Morrissey in Las Vegas, Nevada. Cameron is the author of 2 books, The Manager's Diary, Thinking Outside the Cubicle, and The 7 Deadly Sins of Leadership and How to Overcome Them in Yourself and Others. He has a career in business that spans over 20 years and includes management positions in a broad range of organizations, from Fortune 500 companies and government entities to small businesses. This wide range of experience provides inspiration for his blog, Facebook, and Twitter content, which is shared with his over 500,000 followers. Cameron, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here today, Angela.
Well, so tell me, first of all, congratulations on all your success. I was just so impressed with your blog, your social media, and your books. What kind of inspired you to go down this path?
It started probably a little over a decade ago in my management career. All of a sudden, I just kind of realized I was having a lot of what I would consider bad management deja vu moments, where I kind of kept making the same mistake over and over again. I mean, silly things, time management mistakes, interactions with employees, that sort of thing. And so I just kind of started writing them down and keeping a list of those that I could review. And the list grew, and I started adding in bits of wisdom I might get from executives or peers as I was looking at their work and working alongside them. And that started a Twitter account, which eventually morphed into a Facebook account as well. And then I started doing longer form blog posts and then eventually books. It just kind of evolved. And I've been really pleased with how much it's just resonated with the public. It really started out completely selfishly and has grown into something really fantastic.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So you said that, this kind of evolved through your own career. And I know we were just talking before we started that, in addition to all of the things that you're doing around leadership and management, you actually also have sort of like a regular 9-to-5 job as well. Could you tell me a little bit about your work history and kind of how you have gone through a number of different types of roles?
Yeah, when we were talking about it earlier, I just kind of realized that I have had kind of an eclectic work history a little bit. I got my start in government organizations pre-graduation from college, and that kind of taught me the importance of budgeting and justifying your existence as most organizations have to do in government entities. And then it kind of just went from retail into retail after that, and retail management, and then different opportunities I had to join hospitality, and that's really where my career took off, was with MGM Resorts International here in Vegas. I spent 12 years with them, and in a large company like that, there's a number of opportunities if you make yourself available to them. And so my career grew from literally what I believe was the second lowest paying job in the company into heading up a consolidation of reservation centers and 500 employees reporting to me and that sort of thing. But it happens in a lot of companies. You kind of reach a point where you might be kind of, I don't want to say pushed off in a corner, but you're siloed, and your career trajectory is kind of limited. And so I looked for an opportunity there and jumped at an opportunity to open up a multi-billion-dollar resort here in Las Vegas, and that was really fantastic. And then I jumped from there when the opportunities closed out into a much smaller company, which I currently work for. I'll leave this interview and actually head into work for probably an hour to check on some work that's being done there over the weekend. Wow,
that's interesting. So how long have you been in Las Vegas?
I've been here for about 15 years. I was born and raised up in Seattle.
Okay.
But shortly, probably a few years after graduating from college, I got tired of the weather up in Seattle. Love it to death up there, but those winters can be a little tough. And had an opportunity to move down to Las Vegas and kind of start over, and it's worked out really well since then.
Oh, that's great. So you moved for work then?
I moved to get out of Seattle.
Oh, okay.
And as many of your followers and listeners can relate to, it was an opportunity where Vegas wouldn't have necessarily been my first choice, but I had an opportunity for a job down here. A friend was able to arrange, and so it was the job that kind of led to the destination.
Yeah, but the market in Vegas has really grown a lot in the last 15 years, hasn't it? I mean, it seems like some really great things have happened. It
is. You know, the recession hit us hard here, certainly for a couple of years, but it's a city that just grows and grows. There's a lot of opportunity out here, and a lot of people that I feel there's an entrepreneurial spirit out here a little bit. People that want to change, that want to make a difference. It attracts them out here to the middle of the desert. And so the economy has definitely picked up over the last couple of years in particular.
Oh, that's good. Well, so you mentioned kind of this varied career path where you were going between different types of roles. Was that an organic process, or did you kind of, take some really deliberate steps to sort of make that happen?
Both.
Okay.
It's a couple of things that I've held on to that I've gotten from peers and from superiors is you want to be looking to grow in your career, usually every couple of years, every 2 to 3 years. And one that stood out is if you can't find the growth internally, then you may need to change ladders. As the saying goes, or switch companies. And so, it was an organic process, and that opportunities, presented themselves to me early on in my career, and I was able to take advantage of those. But when those opportunities kind of stalled, that's when I started looking, and so that's a very deliberate process. And my last 3 career moves have all been very deliberate in what they entailed. In fact, speaking about that 2 years thing, most recently in my current company, and one I didn't mention earlier, is really more of an intrapreneurship sort of thing, where I've been given the opportunity to kind of start an entirely new division in the company and an extraordinary amount of autonomy to do so. But that's 2 years in again. And so I look to see what that does as far as from a growth perspective. But if you make yourself available and show what you're worth, I've never been afraid to take a step backwards if the experience is going to be there in the long run. And that's really paid dividends for me where, I've been able to, it's not a steady progression forward necessarily. It has some back steps, but if it's 1 step back and 2 steps forward, then that's definitely something that I would be interested in from my career trajectory.
Absolutely. That's really interesting that you're getting to sort of start something, brand new. And you bring up a really good point about the, switching it up every 2 to 3 years and sort of changing ladders is how you said. I think that tends to be somewhat generational. I mean, I know with my parents and with my grandparents, when I've switched career paths or jobs every, say 3 years, they get very uncomfortable because that's really different. Have you encountered that where some people have said to you, wow, Cameron, you're switching a lot? Like, have you seen people get uncomfortable?
Well, I feel it, Angela. I've done an extraordinary amount of hiring in my day. And when I look at resumes and I see that switch every couple of years, whether I'm caught in that cross-generational thing, but that it gets the hackles on the back of my neck going a little bit, and I have to take a little bit of a deeper dive into it. So I always look for the reasons, and when sitting down with a prospective employee in an interview, I usually ask the reasons why they made the jumps, and hopefully they have good responses to that. But as long as there's a reason for it, I don't think there's ever a problem with it. Yes, my parents have mentioned, moving a career or moving employers every couple of years. That's been brought up a couple of times, but I've always been able to explain it to them, and they've cut me some slack so far.
Yeah, no, I find it interesting. And, sometimes I work with clients who are older that haven't taken that path, and now it's a really big transition for them. It's quite difficult because maybe they've been at one employer for 15 or 20 years and they want to try to go somewhere else, but they haven't interviewed in a very long time, and maybe their salary is no longer competitive. Like, there are a lot of sort of obstacles at this point that they kind of have to overcome. So I think that's interesting.
And I by no means, want to say that you need to be switching employers constantly. I mean, I always look internally at the opportunities that are available. It's much easier to move up and around within the company that you currently work for than to switch to an entirely different company. So both of those opportunities are available to you. Look at both of them for sure.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And when you talk about sort of, you mentioned, leaving companies versus staying with a company. I had someone once say to me, people join companies and they leave bosses. And so, I work with a number of people. They come to me when they're ready to make a career change. And oftentimes it's because they're unhappy with their current boss. And in your book, The 7 Deadly Sins of Leadership, I know that, you address a lot of leadership problems that, management has, from like anything from poor communication to poor hiring to micromanagement. I mean, from your perspective, what are some of the mistakes that managers are making that are causing these employees to be unhappy?
It's a question I've been getting a lot since the book was published. Mm-hmm. And I kind of take those 7 and boil it down to 2. Employees get frustrated with management for two main reasons I see, and that is control and communication. Anybody who's moved from an employee role to a management role, they were usually given that promotion based on their individual performance. Mm-hmm. That those are your star employees. They're the go-to people when you need something done. You give it to them. They knock it out of the park, and so for that reason you give them a management role. But management is an entirely different skill set than being a great employee. Mm-hmm. When you move into management, now you have to start working through people. And there's an enormous amount of managers that never make that transition from being a great employee to being somebody who can create great employees and foster great employeeship. The common stumbling blocks are a lack of the ability to delegate the task. They'll be given a task by their boss, and they'll try to run with it. And they'll get crunched for time, which then makes them short and unavailable to their employees. Or they will actually delegate it, but then they will micromanage the process because they are used to that level of control, and that's what they've been rewarded for in the past. I see a number of managers in my work that still suffer from those things, and I've seen it in vice presidents. I've seen it in presidents of companies where they still don't delegate well, or they micromanage the process too much. The other area is communication, especially in the information age that we live in now. Bosses need to be communicating constantly with their employees, just on the individual employee performance, where the company is going, where their decisions are made. And you see it a lot more with the millennials who want to have more of a stake in where the company is going, getting that feedback from the employee and making the employee feel like they have a voice and they have some control over the direction of the department and the company. Those are really the control and the communication are the two things that will distance a manager from their employees quicker than anything.
That makes sense. I see that a lot, especially, my background is actually digital marketing. And what I've seen with digital marketing as an industry is that people who work in that industry tend to get promoted very young to director or VP positions. I was actually promoted to be a director when I was 26. And I was promoted because I understood computer programming, because I understood things like Google AdWords, not because I had been in a leadership role. And I think many of my peers have been the same way. And so I could definitely see that there's just a lot of room for growth when you're being promoted because of some expertise, and that expertise may or may not actually be management skills. And that can be really hard, I think, both for the employees and for the manager who's in that role for the first time. And then on the communication piece, That's interesting because you mentioned millennials. I mean, it sounds like what you're observing is that sort of the expectations must be changing along with sort of as this generational change is taking place. I mean, is that true?
Oh, absolutely. I discuss it with some of my older managers who report to me, and it's to speak frankly about it. My boss tells me to do something, and I do it. I don't question it.
Right.
And they are constantly being asked by the younger employees why. Why not just why are you giving this to me, but why is it important? Why should I do it? Why should we do it? And it's that extra level that they're not used to, and we're all adapting to it, and it's all actually extraordinarily good and healthy for the organization. But it's a challenge, especially for older generation managers.
Yeah, that's funny. I actually was working with a client on Friday who mentioned to me that she was reading up on millennials, just for that exact reason, just to understand more of what they're looking for so that she can be the best manager possible to them. So that's an interesting observation. Well, speaking of communication, you recently wrote a blog post on your website about the importance of just saying hello. And as an introvert myself, I know that this is kind of a big deal. Can you talk to us a little bit about the importance of being friendly in the workplace?
Yeah, it's one of the main traits of good employees, good managers, everybody is the ability to foster collaboration. Mm-hmm. And it's the friendly person that can do that most easily, or is viewed as being able to do that most easily. And the reason I wrote about that hello blog post was an incident that I had where I came in for the day and I said hello to my boss, and my boss just kept walking the other way.
Oh, wow.
And so I, stayed away from my boss the whole rest of the day until the very end. She said, you didn't come by today. I needed to talk to you about some things. And I was like, well, it just seemed like you were, not particularly in a good mood or anything. And she's like, oh no, that's not the case. I'm sorry, I must have been distracted or thinking about something else. But that's how we view somebody who doesn't say hello or doesn't say goodbye. And it's so easy to make those misperceptions in communication. And so, part of the blog post, the idea is just to get back to the basics. Say hello to people when you see them. Say goodbye to people, at the end of the day. Ask them how their day is going, how lunch was. Those basics are the door openers to communication, and they let people know that you're in a good mood or, open to being spoken to. And those are the doors to collaboration, which are so important in today's work environment.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree. It's funny. I think sometimes, especially introverts, are sometimes perceived as not being in a good mood or something must be wrong. Just like you mentioned, when your boss walked by and you assumed for the day that maybe something must be wrong today. And on the opposite, I've worked with extroverts before who may not actually be technically as good at their particular position, but they're viewed very, very positively because they're just so friendly. I mean, they almost overcome it.
Yeah, no, and that's absolutely the case. When you look to promote people or to hire people, you want somebody who is positive and who you want to work with, and that tends to be those extroverts, and it's regardless of performance or skill set or what have you. That's the perception, and sometimes that perception is not necessarily the reality.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, in your book, The Manager's Diary, you talk about the importance of finding the solution rather than the problem. And I know for me, I actually had a personal experience at work at one of my previous employers where I had a coworker who would often go straight to our boss, which was the chief marketing officer, and she would let him know the building was going to burn down at any moment. That was kind of her approach. And I remember pulling her aside and I said, listen, this is not my style. Let's work together. let's present a solution when we find a problem rather than presenting the problem. And so anyway, I really appreciated this as far as a takeaway for both managers and for the individual contributors. I mean, can you talk a little bit from your perspective in terms of why this is important?
Well, it's from the perspective of the problem itself, finding the problem. I call it the lazy version of management. Anybody can point to the problems. Those are almost all readily apparent. It's the solutions that are tough to find. And if you want to be proactive, if you want to be positive, that's what you need to be doing. As far as managing your boss, I have always found that, when I've made a mistake or when I've discovered a problem, it's a far easier conversation with my boss if I actually am presenting a solution. So this happened, and I think we should do this, is a much easier conversation than bringing them the problem and then making them come up with the solution themselves. Now it's kind of a double whammy. A, there's a problem, and B, now they have to expend the work on it. But also, it gets back to, actually solving the problem. And when you bring up and you focus on the problem and what happened and who's responsible and where did it all go wrong and all of that, the person that is responsible or everybody in the room who doesn't want to be blamed for it immediately gets defensive. And that's not any sort of place where, the solution tends to come from or, collaboration comes from either. So it's important to look at the problem and the causes of the problem and all of that, but you really need to quickly move to solutions wherever possible and come up with those.
I totally agree. I think when you focus really on the problem, it's more like you're focusing on the past rather than like, how are we going to fix this? Let's move forward. And I also kind of feel like if you can't present the solution, like, why are you here? Why do you work here? You should be looking for how can we fix this? I mean, to me, you only present just the problem if you truly have no idea where to begin to fix it.
Exactly. Anybody can point to the house that's burning down and say, hey, look, it's on fire.
Right.
It takes somebody else to go, okay, well, where's the fire hydrant? Has anybody called the fire department? Is there a hose available? That sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, onto a kind of a different topic. I work with a lot of folks who are wanting to transition from an individual contributor role where, they go in every day, they're just responsible for themselves, to a manager's role where they'll be managing people for the first time. Do you have any recommendations from your perspective on how to jump from an individual contributor to manager?
It's interesting you mentioned that because my cousin actually just recently, a couple weeks ago, reached out to me. And she was applying for a supervisor role in a different department. And she was really excited about the department and the work and the opening and everything, but she was absolutely petrified because she had no management experience. And I kind of went through her resume, and I pointed out, I'm like, no, you have management experience. It's just not with a title or with the specific, reporting employees, that sort of thing. What I tell people is look for areas where you've taken ownership and where you've had supervisory-like interactions with people. So if there's projects that you've worked on for your boss, that's exactly what I'm given when my boss comes to me. Is a project, and I take ownership of it, and I get it across the finish line. And if there's any area that you are the specialist in that nobody else handles, that you're the go-to person, that's ownership. That's so much of what management is perceived to be is somebody who's going to take responsibility for something. And those are the points that you highlight. And my favorite one, and this is the one that I had my cousin jump on, was training. She was the trainer for her department, and so, right there, she is explaining how the organization works. She knows it backwards and forwards, and those people are basically reporting to her for 2 to 3 weeks. And so she can see, how they're doing, make adjustments in their performance, that sort of thing. And those are the sort of things to highlight on. But look for areas where you've taken ownership and where you've had that interaction with people, and then you can speak intelligently on that and then what you would do. So there's no reason that you can't tell your interviewer what you would do in a particular situation. You've got an employee who continually is showing up late to work. Well, what would you do? You don't necessarily have to have the exact experience to draw on, but you can say, you know what, in my experience, when bosses will, speak directly to me about the issue and tell me exactly what they want, then that's something that I would respond to. And so that's what I would look to do with that particular employee. And so I think most people have more supervisory and management experience than they believe that they have, and so they can really drive on that in interviews.
I totally agree. Did you recommend that your cousin also kind of highlight that in her resume, or
Yes, actually. Well, that's where I got most of it from.
Okay.
Was just being able to pick it out from her resume. And full disclosure, she didn't get the job, but but I think she feels certainly more confident in applying for those things. And that's
Absolutely.
It's another reason to stay with a company as opposed to looking elsewhere too. When you're looking to move up those career ladders from, employee to supervisor, from supervisor to manager, manager to director, onward and upward, those moves are often most easily done, within the company in my experience.
That makes total sense. And I think, sometimes when people apply to jobs, it'll say management experience required, and that's where they get kind of intimidated. But, at some point, everybody didn't have official management experience. And I think you're right. When you dig into what you've done in the past, most people who end up in management roles, or many people, let me say, many of them are natural leaders. And when they look back, into their history, whether it was in organizations that they were a part of or projects at work, they ended up in charge of some things. And I think there are a lot of good ways. Like you said, you could highlight it on your resume. You can talk about it in the interview. There are a lot of ways to kind of sell yourself. But I think most importantly, you need to be confident. Because if you walk in and you're sort of, a little, intimidated by the whole experience, it's going to be much harder to believe that you could transition into that role than if you truly believe in yourself.
Yeah, and you may have hit on this before with the people that you work with, Angela. But I've hired probably a couple hundred people, and I've done 1,000 interviews.
Wow!
And there is no perfect candidate. I can probably count on my fingers and toes the number of resumes that have come across my desk where I said, "Oh, this is perfect." And you know what? I didn't hire most of those people either because they still weren't the right fit. So I would tell your listeners to go for the job if you feel like you're the right fit for it, because odds are the recruiter and the interviewer isn't looking at a whole bunch of resumes that have 5 years of applicable work experience and a history in the industry and that sort of thing. It's extraordinarily rare.
I totally agree with what you're saying, and I actually talk with my clients about that all the time because, they'll come in and have this huge job description and say, well, I can do 9 out of these 10 things, but the 10th thing I'm not so sure about. And, it's rare, like you said, that the perfect candidate is going to walk through the door. Oftentimes, I think when you interview, it's as much a culture fit as anything else. And I think companies are willing to kind of make an exception for you if there's one area that maybe you still need to grow in. I think they'll give you a chance to do that. Did you find that when you were hiring?
I kind of go back to my 2 best hires in the last couple of years had no applicable work history whatsoever, but they could speak intelligently to what they did, why they liked it, and when I was asking them questions and going through things, they just had that sort of positive and confident role like you spoke of there, where I was just very much at ease. And as somebody who hires people, I have to ask myself whether I want to work with this person or not. And to your point of culture fit, that's absolutely key. But if I know what you're capable of, you may find that you've only hit on 2 of the 10 applicable job things, and then you're getting called in for the job.
Right. So with those 2 hires that were so successful, I mean, what convinced you that they were the right people, even though they didn't have all the experience that you were hoping for?
It really came down to what they had done in their prior jobs. So I currently work for a manufacturing company, and one of them was a journalism major. But he could take me through basically project management on working on a story for the school paper and then for the small city paper that he worked in, and that was absolutely applicable to what I was doing. I mean, here's a guy who was writing for a newspaper, and I'm bringing him in to work in manufacturing and forecasting and that sort of thing. But he could speak intelligently to it, and he didn't even necessarily walk me through the way that his work experience worked with what I was looking for. I could see that myself. And so you don't always have to put together all of the pieces of the puzzle for the interviewer. A good interviewer will be able to do that for you. But really just put me at ease that whatever I gave him to do, it was going to be knocked out of the park. And then the other one, that one was just more of blind confidence.
Okay.
Like without the arrogance, because those 2 can go hand in hand. But he was just so confident in his ability to do things and was able to stay positive and not arrogant about it that he walked out, and I mean, I could have just called him back in and offered him the job right there.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, I think that speaks a lot to you as well, though, because I actually work with a lot of candidates who want to make a big career jump. I started my own career. My first job was working for General Motors as an engineer, and my most recent career was working as the head of digital marketing for a bank. And so I work with a lot of clients who want to make a really big career change. And a lot of times, it's also dependent on that hiring manager being able to see outside the box, see outside sort of the lines, and have a little faith, because not all hiring managers are willing to do that. And I think when you make a big change like that, you're kind of on the hook to talk to more people than you would otherwise, because you have to find the ones that are, willing to take that risk. For sure.
No, I cast a very wide net, a very, very wide net when I'm doing interviews. And I'd say I probably I'll interview 7 or 8 people for every one person that I look to hire.
That's great.
So I don't know whether that is as far as an industry average, but it's certainly more than any of the peers that I work with manage. But I want to see all of those random people, because there are some great diamonds in the rough out there.
Oh, I love that. That's great. Well, so when you talk to someone, I mean, I work with clients sometimes, they're already in a management position. Maybe it's the first time they've been in one, or maybe they've been in one for a long time and they just, have always kind of struggled. But for people that are struggling to manage their employees and to kind of get comfortable in that role, I mean, what suggestions do you have? I mean, what could they do to make it better?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, even if you're experienced in management, there's going to be those times where I want to say, hit those doldrums, or just make a couple of missteps and you're not connecting with your employees like you should. It's a reality. So realize that you're not doing something tragically wrong, that everybody goes through it from time to time. I often just get back to the basics. There's a couple of books that I get back to, and that's, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, and then The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And I've probably read each of those half a dozen times at miscellaneous points, and a lot of those points are when I'm starting to have a struggle. And I'm usually able to pick up some tips and some things there, and it's part of it is the ambiguity of not knowing what to do. At least with those books, I can tend to find a plan of next steps that I want to take. And then a couple other things that I recommend to people that are kind of going through those doldrums is find some way to have fun. Whether it is a potluck on one random Friday, whether it is, playing music loud, something to have some fun. will kind of break that doldrum that you're in. And then the other thing is finding some sort of success. A lot of times it's just because we're having a tough go of it. Our employees aren't doing as well as we think they should. We don't think that we're doing as well by our employees as we think we should. But I guarantee that every one of us has some successes that are out there. We may be just being way too hard on ourselves, but there are some successes out there. And if you find those, then you can look to build upon those. And, at least in this area, I'm doing well. And so, okay, now that I'm doing well in that area, what else could I do? And getting that starting point and then building back up. But we all go through those tough times, and especially with young managers, it's even more difficult because you're a little bit of a fish out of water. But know that it's going to come if you keep working at it.
I totally agree. I remember, 5 years ago or so, I was talking with a friend of mine who is a vice president at a large corporation, and I said to her, "Gosh, you're such a good manager. How long did it take you to really feel comfortable and, confident that you were managing well?" And I believe she said at least 10 years. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, that feels like a really long time.
It does, and I mean, I hate to say that I feel like I am good at what I'm doing, because there is just so much learning, and I to a certain extent can't imagine doing the blog and the social media and the books if I wasn't currently managing people and trying to lead people, because I'm learning something every day, every week. There's something out there for me to be better at, and some new position or new situation that I'm being put into. One of the things that I do address in the book is that you can also be good at something and then all of a sudden just fall flat on your face with it. It's those there's just certain human characteristics where you can be great at something for a while, and then there's just some sort of trigger, and all of a sudden you can't do it right to save your life. And we all go through those times, and so it's a constant learning process.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that just makes me think of one other question, which is, do you give any advice in your books about, sort of how to pick yourself up again if you've been fired or laid off and you weren't sort of expecting it? Because we're kind of talking about some challenges that folks might be facing. And sometimes, what you end up really facing is a huge challenge, is that you end up without a job when you weren't expecting it.
Yeah, and I hate to give the cliche advice that that those are the times when you can pick yourself up and you start a new course and the door opens when one closes and that sort of thing. But learning from failure is what every great company, individual, country, whatever has been able to do. And you just pick yourself up. It's rarely, in this day and age of layoffs, that sort of thing. It's not the kiss of death. You are going to be able to find an employer who, isn't going to be interested in it because they see it all the time. You have that worth, and you just kind of get back to square one, and you put together the resume. What have I done? What have I accomplished? What successes have I had? And you lean on that, and then you just kind of get to work. And it's a gut check, and it's going to make you stronger in the end. I was let go from a position early on in my career, and it was for that reason that I ended up at the company I was with for 12 years and left as a director and that sort of thing. And that opportunity wouldn't have been there if I didn't get let go because they were shutting down one of the 4 stores in the district.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I mean, I have clients that'll come in and, the first time we'll meet, they'll start to cry because it's really emotional to talk about that they've been fired or let go. And typically they feel like, they're the only person that this has ever happened to. So it takes some time to kind of work through that. But I think, sometimes maybe there just wasn't a good fit with your manager, or maybe, like you said, maybe a location was closing, maybe a company was downsizing. But I do think it is a fairly normal experience that a lot of people go through at some point in their career or another, and it's just about continuing to move forward. I think I had a mentor once who told me something like, if you've never been fired, you're doing something wrong. Like you're not
taking enough risks.
Yeah, like if you don't have an opinion that would piss people off, maybe you're in the wrong role, or you're doing something that, you need to be more aggressive. So that's interesting. Well, we've talked about a lot of different topics today. Is there any other advice that you'd like to touch on for our listeners?
I think I touched on it a little bit before, but for managers specifically and employees, less specifically, there is no way to communicate too much. And you talk about that with the hellos, the goodbyes, the checking in, the giving of feedback, that sort of thing. You as an employee have insight that your manager doesn't have. And you don't want to be that person that's breaking down their door every hour trying to give them insight. But you do have that. And so you should be giving that as much as possible, whether you have one-on-ones with your manager or whatever. You have those ideas that are out there. And then from a management perspective, you simply have to be talking to your employees about what's going on in their day, what's going on in the company, where it's going, that sort of thing. Communication makes the world go round right now more than it ever has in history, really. And people are demanding it more, and the employers and the employees that communicate most effectively are going to be the ones that win in the end.
Oh, absolutely. That's great advice. Well, so my very last question for you, you have 2 books, The Manager's Diary, Thinking Outside of the Cubicle, and The 7 Deadly Sins of Leadership and How to Overcome Them in Yourself and Others. If our listeners are interested to purchase your book, where should they go?
They're both available on Amazon and Kindle, right at your fingertips.
Oh, that's great. And what about if they're interested to follow you? I know you have both a blog and you have Twitter. Where should they go?
They can go to themanagersdiary.com, and that has all of my blog posts on it, and then links to all of my social media accounts as well.
Oh, that's excellent. And do you ever work with folks one-on-one? Does anyone ever sort of reach out to you directly?
There are a few that I work with one-on-one on a more regular basis.
Okay.
But I field questions on almost a daily basis from employees and managers and how to deal with, each other, I guess. I'm always available at Cameron at themanagersdiary.com or through any of the social media channels as well. I'll field questions from everywhere.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, Cameron, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much, Angela. I really appreciate it.
Well, this has been super helpful. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Tune in next week for another edition of the Copeland Coaching Podcast. And if you've enjoyed the program today, be sure to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher to make sure you never miss an episode.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.